In 1517, Martin Luther took a stand against the dominant Catholic Church by nailing his 95 Theses on a church in Wittenberg, Germany. This resulted in an important religious shift in Christianity's history, the Reformation. Luther's actions made people begin to question the ideas of the church that had been accepted for many centuries. Luther's stand and beliefs left a legacy that still exists today.
One of Luther's big impacts is that he initiated a process that led to a split in the church, the religion, the Christianity of Western and Central Europe.
Martin Luther was born on November 10, 1483 in Ellsberg, Saxony. His parents, Hans and Margaret Luther, wished for Martin Luther to have a better life than they had and wanted him to become a lawyer. In 1501, Martin Luther enrolled in the University of Erfurt, and it seemed like he was on his way to becoming a lawyer. However, Martin Luther encountered a life-changing experience that started his road to becoming a revolutionary thinker. In July 1505, Luther got caught in a thunderstorm and prayed for his life. He vowed to become a monk if he survived. Eventually, the storm subsided and he lived. Luther felt obligated to keep his promise, which disappointed his parents. On July 17, 1505, Martin Luther joined a rigorous monastery in Erfurt, the Augustinian Priory. He found life at the monastery to be difficult and was confused and discouraged by the immorality and corruption of Catholic priests there. He then enrolled in the University of Wittenberg to help end his spiritual confusion. He succeeded in his studies, received a doctorate, and became a professor of theology. Finally, through intensive studies of Scripture, Luther gained spiritual enlightenment, and in 1513, he began to write lectures of his own. 2 years later, while preparing a lecture about Romans, he read, "The just will live by faith," Romans chapter 1, verse 17. He dwelled on this statement for some time. Finally, he realized that the key to spiritual salvation was not to fear God or be forced to believe something, but to believe that faith alone would bring salvation. This period marked a major change in his life and set in motion the Reformation. At that time, the Catholic Church had a strong grip over Western Europe. Everybody was taught to follow the Catholic Church in order to avoid hell and enter heaven. The Church was extremely wealthy because everybody always had to pay a tithe, or 10% of their yearly earnings. They were also told that failure to pay this would also lead to an instant passage to hell. Because of the sale of indulgences, people thought they could commit sins without a problem, because they could just buy their way out of them. This angered Luther, which led to a stand against the Church.
Well, there had been, in Europe, during the Middle Ages, there had been earlier critiques of like the corruption of priests, even some critiques of popes, right, for not living up to the standards expected of religious leaders. But what Martin Luther argued and was able to kind of successfully build a movement around was a complete rejection of the idea of a priesthood and the structure of the Catholic Church, right, under the authority of the Pope.
On October 31st, 1517, Martin Luther angrily nailed his 95 Theses onto the door of his church in Wittenberg, Germany, after Pope Leo X began a new sale of indulgences to fund the building of a new church called St. Peter's Basilica. A friar named John Tetzel came to Germany to sell these indulgences, and knowledge of Tetzel's actions prompted Luther to post his theses, the Disputation on the Power of Indulgences.
It looks pretty clear that Luther did also want to really cause a stir, right? He really wanted to present a challenge to the ecclesiastical hierarchy. He didn't simply want to engage in a debate, but really to initiate a kind of more radical movement.
Okay. The entire thesis is based around the central idea that indulgences do not work and that they will only make God mad. Luther believed that only God could forgive sins, not a scrap of paper. Luther also pointed out that the Pope had no power over purgatory and that the only punishments he could forgive are the ones he gave out himself. One of Luther's other main points is that indulgences shouldn't be sold to build St. Peter's Basilica. He argued, why does not the Pope, whose wealth is today greater than the wealth of the richest Croesus, who build this one Basilica of St. Peter with his own money rather than with the money of poor believers? Luther thought that instead of taking money from people who can't afford to pay, the Pope, who is one of the richest people in Europe, should pay at least in part for the basilica. Some of Luther's beliefs were the ideas that God gives justice and grace through faith alone, not good works and especially not indulgences. He also believed that priests were not needed to act as middlemen for the people and God, and that the Pope didn't have authority to guide the life of a Christian. Luther stressed that the Bible was the central religious authority, not the priests. He also continued to preach that all people can reach salvation through their faith and not their good deeds.
This kind of notion of looking only to the sacred text, right, the Bible, as a kind of the sole source for understanding about God and the relationship of the believer to God, because of the way that emphasizes both the importance of reading, the importance of being able to understand the written word, and also the responsibility and the freedom of each individual to have to engage in that reading and to develop what for Luther, of course, in theological terms, is a relationship with God, right?
The posting of Luther's 95 Theses marked the beginning of the Reformation. Under the Reformation, a new form of Christian faith emerged, called Protestantism. Protestants shared Luther's beliefs that the Church was wrong, so they separated from the Roman Catholic Church and eventually became different branches of Christianity. Luther's bold denunciation and translation of the New Testament made people reconsider what the Roman Catholic Church has been doing. This revolutionary movement caused a religious, political, intellectual, and cultural upheaval. Martin Luther faced many challenges for his defiance toward the Roman Catholic Church. Once Luther's 95 Theses reached Rome, Pope Leo X was put in dismay. He started to respond by ordering the Vicar General of the Augustine Order to put a ban of silence on monks. After a year of unproductive negotiations, the Pope issued the Exsurge Domini in 1520. This papal bull was a direct attack on Luther and ordered the withdrawal of some 41 theological errors the Church found wrong with his writings. Luther then responded by publicly burning his copy of the papal bull, along with some volumes of the Catholic Church's canon law. On January 1521, Pope Leo X excommunicated Luther. The matter was then turned over to secular authorities, and Luther was ordered to appear before the Diet of Worms. This was a general assembly of the Holy Roman Empire conducted by Emperor Charles V. There, Martin Luther was asked whether or not he supported his writings, but Luther made a stand and claimed that he will not reject his writings unless somebody proves it's wrong through Scripture. Eventually, the Edict of Worms passed and Martin Luther was named a heretic. Martin Luther took refuge in Wittenberg and began his translation of the New Testament as the Reformation strengthened. The translation of the New Testament was one of Luther's greatest accomplishments because it was the first time ordinary people could read and interpret the Bible for themselves. This gave them freedom to agree about the meaning and move more people to this cause. Though still under threat of arrest, Martin Luther returned to Wittenberg Castle Church in Eisenach in May 1522. He was able to avoid capture and began organizing a new church, Lutheranism. Today, Lutheranism is one of the largest Protestant Christian denominations. What made the Reformation so significant was that it was a period where people started to question the beliefs that the Roman Catholic Church made them accept. The Catholic Church was scaring people with hellfire stories and claimed that if people paid the church, they could buy their way into heaven. In reality, it was just greedy clergy members using people to fund church projects and to get more money for themselves. Luther's reforms ended up causing the Catholic Church to change some of its practices to draw people away from Luther.
In terms of the surviving Catholic Church, in areas where Catholicism remains strongly in place, that church responds by trying to initiate a series of reforms to both address some of the concerns that church leaders identify as the roots of Luther's popularity, so certain forms of clerical corruption, clerical excess.
Luther's actions still resonate today, as more than 36% of Christians are Protestant. Also, the Reformation paved the way for the scientific revolution. Luther showed that the church was not always right, which prompted other people to start questioning the church's doctrine on how the world worked. Without the Reformation, many scientific achievements would not have happened, and the world would be different, and we would not have many life-changing objects that we have today. Martin Luther was a revolutionary thinker who changed European history by bringing forth the split of the Roman Catholic Church. His goal to please God fueled him to translate the Bible and take a stand for what he believed were God's true wishes.